So in this course, we've been using the following symbols for not and or. But there's some variations on these that you'll find in logic textbooks and papers and books. And it's important to be aware of them if you're going to read any of those kinds of things. Part of the reason for this variation is because a lot of logic written in the 20th century was run off of actual literal printing presses. This is well before we had such handy tools as LaTeX, much less MS Word or Google Drive. Actually, if you look at a lot of printed text run off of printing presses, you'll see that the or symbol is just a large capital V in a sans serif font that gets flipped upside down for the and symbol. I often think that the printers who had to do all this flipping of text are kind of the unsung heroes of 20th century logic. I think their work must have been unbelievably difficult. For my part, I worked in a print shop for about 2 years, and I can't imagine what it would be like to set even one page from Principia Mathematica in lead type, much less a whole book. I think if someone came in there saying, oh yes, please have all these upside down and sideways letters, and by the way, even a slight error can completely change the meaning and ruin the text, I would probably quit my job. All right, so for alternative symbols, for negation, we've been using this bar with a little hook at the end, but often enough you'll see this symbol as well, which gets used quite frequently, especially because people already have it on their keyboards. Sometimes you'll also see negation written as a horizontal bar over top of the sentence that's meant to be negated. This is actually quite convenient because it gives you a nice visual of the negation scope. So for instance, clearly in this sentence, it's just the P that's negated, whereas if we extend the bar to cover the whole P and Q, it's clear that the whole thing is being negated. And in certain older textbooks, as well as programming languages, you'll sometimes see an exclamation mark written in front of the sentence, like this. This actually still gets used in programming languages like Java. Finally, there's a lot of logic written with so-called Polish notation or Warsaw notation, which mostly uses capital letters for logical symbols and writes negation as a capital N like this. This capital V for or is pretty standard, and it's the one you're going to see in most places. There are some variants on it which are quite rare. Sometimes you'll see 2 vertical bars between the sentences, or even 1 vertical bar. The 1 vertical bar is a bit of a pain because it looks identical with what's sometimes called the Sheffer stroke, which actually means neither nor. So P Sheffer stroke Q is neither P nor Q, but context should tell you what's being talked about. Sometimes you also see this written as a plus symbol. This is less common, but it's used in contexts where it's referred to as logical addition. If you think back on our Venn diagrams for disjunction, you can see why putting together 2 terms like this would look something like addition. We also have the and symbol, which we're writing as this upside down V or kind of vertical wedge. And it's very common to see this written actually as the ampersand, which is just a stylization of the Latin word et, which means and. Sometimes this is duplicated, so you'll see P ampersand ampersand Q. Less commonly, you'll see a dot, and sometimes you'll even see the letters just put right next to each other with no space in between, on analogy with multiplication. There's also an interesting sense in which the comma works a bit like the term and. If you go on to do more advanced logic, you're bound to see a deduction theorem, and this involves formulas like this, which just says that a set of sentences gamma plus a sentence phi entails some other sentence psi. But the comma in this is kind of like the comma in a list, and in that sense it's conjunctive. If you want a more mundane example, you have your grocery list with, eggs, comma, milk, comma, bread. You could alternatively write this as eggs and milk and bread, and it would mean the same thing. That's roughly the same thing that's going on in a formula like gamma, comma, phi. As for parentheses, there's an older tradition in which the famous Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead was written, in which parentheses are done away with and the scope or power of an operator is shown with dots. So for instance, if you wanted to write P and, in parentheses, Q or R, you would write this as P and symbol dot Q or R. If you wanted, on the other hand, to write P and Q, in parentheses, or R, you would write P and Q dot or symbol R. Basically, nobody uses this anymore, and I think the reason why is obvious. There's also the Polish notation I mentioned a minute ago, or Warsaw notation, or sometimes called Łukasiewicz notation after this famous logician Jan Łukasiewicz. This notation not only uses capital letters, but it often uses prefix notation where the main logical connective is written at the very front of the sentence. This makes it really easy to find the logical connective, but it has a few other drawbacks as well. We could write not P and Q as and not PQ, and not, in parentheses, P and Q, so a negation with sentence-wide scope as not and PQ. As I mentioned, Polish notation uses capital letters for these operators, so N for negation, K for conjunctia, and A for alternativa, which is just or. You might see these as well. But what's really distinctive about this is the prefix notation, as I said, which takes a bit of getting used to. P and parenthetical Q or R would be written KP AQR because the main connector is a conjunctive connector, so that's why the K goes up front. If we wanted to move the parentheses so that they were around the conjunctive part of the sentence, then the whole thing would turn into a disjunction, so it would be A, R, K, P, Q. As I said, a lot of 20th century logic was run off of literal printing presses, but Polish notation has the advantage that it can be done with a typewriter. It's not commonly used anymore except in certain programming languages like Forth and Lisp and PostScript. But it does get used in some of these older calculators, especially the ones built by Hewlett-Packard, as reverse Polish notation, where you enter in the operators after the numbers. So for instance, if you wanted to say 5 plus 2 times 3 with the 5 plus 2 in parentheses, you would write this as 5, 2 plus 3 times. Finally, even earlier than this, in the Middle Ages, when a lot of texts were written in Latin, you're bound to see them in manuscripts or early print books like these. This is actually my main area of specialty. And in these texts, they have a handy little symbol that looks like this. It's a G with a little O over top of it, and that just is a shorthand for ergo. So there's a long history of writing logic texts and of using the tools available to write them, be they a quill or a typewriter or a printing press. And in many ways, we're very lucky to be alive now in a time when we can just run these things off using handy programs like LaTeX.